Does everyone have a handout? If you don't have a handout, raise your hand. Okay, it looks like you. Is this on? Can you hear okay? Higher. It's a great privilege for me to be invited to speak at this place, the Buddhist Library, which is a resource for all the different forms of Buddhism worldwide, for Chinese Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, Southeast Asian Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism. The library here, if you haven't seen it, it is one of the treasures of your community in Singapore. It's an extremely well-stocked library representing the sacred texts of all the traditions of Buddhism. So it is eclectic, it is non-denominational, it crosses all the sectarian lines, and that's a very beautiful thing to see in today's world. And so I'll be talking a little bit more about that. I thought since this is a Buddhist place, and so I'll be giving a Buddhist teaching that will start with a tradition in Buddhism, and that is to examine our motivation before we start. So the teacher examines his motivation and make sure that he's not here teaching for vast riches or for gaining a big reputation or for enhancing his ego. So I do my best to check my motivation, and then the students check their motivation. One of the ways that you can do that is through an image. They call it the making sure that the Starbucks cup is proper. It's well, it's not exactly that in the ancient text. You make sure that your cup is turned over. You know, not put upside down, but you turn your Starbucks cup over so that something can be poured into it. You know, if the cup is just down, you know, wrong side up or wrong side down, then nothing can get poured into it. So that just means that you open your mind a little bit to the possibility that you don't know everything already, and that there might be something to learn. And then you make sure that the Starbucks cup is clean before you put your latte into it. That it's not a used cup that's got some grounds or something like that in, which means you check your motivation. You check why you are here. And there's a couple of bad motivations for coming to a talk like this. One of them is that you just can't think of anything to do in Singapore on a Saturday night. You're kind of bored, and you ran out of places to eat. All the movies you've already seen or something like that. Another bad motivation is to come, we used to call them Dharma monsters. Dharma monsters. Dharma monsters are people who just accumulate facts, Dharma facts, so that they can look better than other people. So that when they hang out with their other friends, Buddhist or otherwise, they just try to impress other people with how much they've learned about Buddhism rather than what they actually have practiced, So there's a couple of bad motivations. The good motivation is pretty simply put. The good motivation is, I want to live a happy life. I want to be a happy person. And I want to help other people be happy too. I don't want to be part of the problem in life. I'd like to be part of the solution. And so maybe what I will learn in a Dharma talk will help me be a happy person so that I can help other people be happy too. That's a good motivation. So that you check the purity of your Starbucks cup. Then you check to see if there's a hole in the bottom of your Starbucks cup. Because if you pour your latte into a Starbucks cup that has a hole in the bottom of it, it leaks out all over the place, right? So this means, this is very important for us nowadays. It means that you don't regard a talk like this as just another form of entertainment or information. We're bombarded with information, right? All the time, day in, day out, from the internet, from our news, from the media and various sorts. And our tendency nowadays, as a kind of survival skill really, because so much is going in, that we just kind of let it go out again, you know? Comes in for a while and then goes out. So, you can check, how much do you remember of the news last week, we have to constantly be shedding information to keep up with the input of information. And coming to a Dharma talk isn't just coming to another infotainment event. We shouldn't regard the Dharma as just more data, more information. It is wisdom. It is the timeless wisdom that could change our lives. And to not just have it go in one ear and then out the other. You listen for an hour, hour and a half, and then you forget all about it. So hopefully something that you will hear tonight will be retained. That you'll hear it and you'll say, well, that sounds like something I should try to put into practice. That sounds like something that could possibly change my life. And it doesn't have to be big thing, doesn't have to be everything, but at least something maybe. You could walk away from the talk and say, okay, now I'm going to make a little change in my life. And not just have it, like I said, go in one ear and out the other. So having checked our motivation, we can start. My intention is to speak for an hour maybe, so that we can leave time at the end for questions, so that if you have questions about about what I've said or about things that you think I can help you with, we'll have time at the end for that, so I'd ask you to hold your questions until then. This is always the most interesting part of an event for me. I know what I'm going to say already. So that's not entirely interesting to me, because I already know what I'm going to say. But I don't know what you're going to say. I don't know what your interests are and your concerns. So I ask you to share them with me and so at the end, so we can have a little conversation at the end. This is a talk on what's called the Four Noble Truths. I've translated it actually on your cover, the cover of this handout, as the Four Worthy Truths. Worthy Truths. Because, they're well known as the Four Noble Truths, so I can refer to them that way too. But in my experience, we don't use the word noble very much anymore, It's a little bit medieval English, kind of, like the nobility, like that. What the word means in Pali and Sanskrit, Arya in Pali and Arya in Sanskrit, means respectable. How's that? You could translate it the Four Respectable Truths, or the Four Worthy Truths, or the Four Noble Truths. This formulation of four statements from the Buddha sort of forms the foundation, the structure, the basic elemental structure of all forms of Buddhism. It is common to all forms of Buddhism. So there's differences in the different Buddhist traditions and the philosophies and in some cases the practices and all like that. But all of them adhere to the idea that the Four Noble Truths are the foundational structure of what's called Buddha Dharma. Buddha Dharma. Buddha Dharma means the Dharma, the truth. Dharma means the truth. Dharma means what's true. That the Buddha taught. And the Buddha taught Dharma. He taught things that would help us live a good life. True things that would help us live a good life. The Buddha did not teach Buddhism. The Buddha did not teach Buddhism. Just like Jesus didn't teach Christianity. And Muhammad didn't deliver Islam, you see. These formulations, these structures, these institutions were formed later, much later. So each one of these religious founders, the great religious founders of the world, Lao Tzu didn't teach Taoism, Lao Tzu taught the truth as he saw it, So it's important to remember that, because sometimes we get hung up on the institutionalization of these traditions. and forget that they were originally, and in their intention, not religions per se. They weren't formulated as institutional religions, but as simply as advices, truth, according to great religious founders, great spiritual teachers and seers. And to get so I will go so far as to say this, that the Four Noble Truths are not necessarily Buddhist at all. They are universal in their truth. Okay? What the Buddha taught was not just for Buddhists. They didn't even know what Buddhists were when the Buddha was teaching. Okay? What the Buddha taught was for everyone. And that remains the case today. Universal application, you see? Universal application of these teachings. And that's also the case with the teachings of Jesus. That's also the case with the prophecies and revelations of Muhammad. That's the case with what Lao Tzu said and Zhangsa, and the great spiritual teachers have taught universal and timeless truths. Universal and timeless. So universal means they're applicable to anyone, regardless of your background, regardless of your religious affiliation or lack thereof, regardless of your culture, regardless of your language group. They're universal truths, and they're timeless in that they're as applicable to us today as they were thousands of years ago. They don't change, There's lots of things in the world that change all the time and are remodified and restructured. But you don't go back to the teachings of the Buddha and change it. You don't just like erase that part that you didn't like and sort of fill it in with something else. You know what I mean? You don't go back to the Tao Te Ching and say, well, I like that verse but not this verse, let's get rid of that one. They're timeless. And that means that they withstand the test of time. They withstand the test of time. It means that, these teachings are assimilated by students. You hear them, you think about them, you contemplate them, you try to put them into practice. And if you do all those things, they work. They work. They succeed in their goal, which is to bring you a happier life. So, it's kind of up to us to try it. You don't know that they're going to work until you actually try them. But millions of people over the course of millennia have heard these teachings before, have contemplated them, have meditated them, and then have tried to practice them. And if they didn't work, we wouldn't have them today, you see? If they didn't function, if they didn't succeed in their intent, people would have forgotten them. They would have lost them. They would have burned them. They would have come up with something better, something new. So these are ancient teachings that are as relevant for us today as they were for people in any era since the time that they were given. So it's important for us to try to make them relevant to ourselves, to see the relevance of them, and not to get stuck in antiquities and just think, oh, well, this is very interesting ancient stuff. But what about, my life here in modern Singapore? The Buddha didn't know about my life in modern Singapore, So maybe it's not that relevant. The Buddha knew everything that he needed to know about what your life in Singapore was going to be like 2,500 years ago. All the essential things he knew, okay? He probably didn't anticipate, iPhones or, shopping, endless shopping malls. But he certainly anticipated the fundamental existential life questions that we all have, and have had as human beings from the very start. So I thought I'd start, before we go into the Four Truths, I thought I'd start by setting the context of these in the story that's told about the Buddha's life. And, the stories that are told about any religious founder's life, Buddha, Jesus, any of them, these aren't necessarily historical reportings of what actually happened, okay? The facts, like you read in the newspaper or something like that. They're what in religious studies, in the academic study of religion, we call myths. And that word is has gotten a very bad reputation in popular culture. In popular English, when we say something is a myth, what do we mean by that? Oh, that's just a myth. Means it's, a lie, basically. Old wives' tale, And that's not what we mean by a myth in religious studies. What we mean by a myth is, as opposed to a historical account, what we mean by a myth is a story that's infinitely relevant, always relevant, you see? Doesn't matter, it didn't happen just one time back in the past and then it was, irrelevant ever since. You see, history is sort of like that. History happens, one time something happens and then it's gone, it's done. A myth is infinitely recyclable, infinitely relevant, okay? So you can get the flavor of what a myth is through the English expression that we sometimes use before we tell a certain kind of a story. Once upon a time. Everyone know that expression? Once upon a time, this thing happened. We use that as a phrase to begin a fairy tale, for example. Once upon a time, Little Red Riding Hood went to see her grandma, but when she got to her grandma's house, she found that her grandma was a wolf. And then you go, oh, wait a minute. How was she actually fooled by a wolf? Come on, she could see it. And if you start to bring the kind of, history, the kind of historical factuality to these stories, it destroys the whole point. It destroys the whole point of them, right? They're archetypes. They're infinitely relevant archetypes. And the once upon a time indicates that it's not happened at any time, you see? You could say it happens at all time, once upon a time. Any time this could have happened. So I'll tell you a quick version of the Buddhist story in the once upon a time mode. Once upon a time, there was a guy named Gautama who was born into great privilege. He was born into a greatly privileged family. A family that had plenty of money, prosperity, who lived in a nice flat with air conditioning when it was too hot, with heating if it got too cold, which it never does here, I guess, right? With, top-of-the-line stereo system, with a plasma television, a huge one, really big one, with all the luxuries and gadgetry of the time. And he lived, because he lived in a privileged environment, he was given the best education. He was, taught how to read, how to write. He was exposed to, knowledge of all sorts, learned. He became very learned as a person. He was taught all kinds of activities, various hobbies. He got to be very, very accomplished at, rollerblading or surfing or skiing or whatever the hobbies were. Does this story sound familiar so far at all to any of you? And he grew up and, he didn't know much about the outside world because he was sort of living in a bubble. He was living in a kind of a bubble where none of the real, hardships, none of the real difficulties of life he was never exposed to them. It was just, he was kind of pampered, right? Never knew what it was like to really go hungry or to have faulty shelter or have not enough clothes or to have diseases that, were preventable with medicine, but they didn't have the medicine. He was never exposed to the realities of life. Sound familiar? Yep. Again, more. And so he got older and older, and he married. He found a partner, and married, and had children, and they moved into their own separate condo. nearby the family, nearby the mom and dad, and started a life, you know, maybe thought about, well, what should I do, you know. He had probably a lot of options because he was, you know, so wealthy and educated, and so he was wondering what he should do with his life and so forth. And then as it happened, he got curious. He got curious about, like, well, what am I missing here, you know? What am I missing about life, living in the little bubble that I've been living in? Is there something outside the bubble? And so the story goes is that he hailed a taxi cab. And he said to the taxi driver, take me out into the real world. Take me out and show me what's actually out in the real world. And so the cabbie said, okay, well, let's go. Jump in. And so Gautama got into the cab, and the cabbie took him out on the streets of the real world. And one of the first things that he saw was someone very, very sick. He saw a very, very sick person, you know, and in those days, they didn't put people who were sick immediately into places like hospitals so other people didn't have to look at them. Sick people were on the street, you know, as they are today, actually, in many, many, many places. In many cities of the world, you know, very, very desperately sick people are just right there on the streets, and they're there to see. And so Gautama had never seen anything like this before. You know, inside the bubble, you know, when anybody got sick, they immediately put them away somewhere in the hospital somewhere so you didn't have to look at them. And so he said to the cabbie, you know, what happened to that person? And the cabbie said, well, that person has gotten sick. And the Buddha said, well, oh my gosh, that's so terrible for that one person, for that to uniquely have gotten a sickness, an illness. And the cabbie goes, you know, sickness, everyone gets sick. Everyone gets ill at some point in their life. Everyone is subject to sickness. And this was amazing to Gautama. You know, he had never thought that. He never had any experience with that. So he went home and, you know, and got a cold drink and, you know, had a nice dinner and took some aspirin and laid down in his air-conditioned, you know, bed, queen size, maybe king, and, you know, tried to recover a little bit. And so the next day he was curious again and, you know, said, well, maybe there's more out there that I haven't seen. So he hails the cabbie again. He says, cabbie, you know, yesterday's trip was so eye-opening. Let's take another one. So the cabbie says, oh, get into the cab. So they go out into the streets of the real world, and pretty soon they see a person who is old, an old person, you know, who can't really walk right and can't really see anymore much, can't hear anything. And again, Gautama had never seen anything like this because in his little bubble, when people got too old, they got shunted away into old folks' home, the old folks' home where you didn't have to look at old people because they were kind of depressing to have to look at old people. So he said, who is this? What is this? What happened to this guy? And the cabbie said, well, he's an old person. And he said, well, oh, how did that happen to that one guy? Uniquely getting old like that. And the cabbie goes, this is what happens to everyone. If you're lucky enough to live long enough, you too will get old. Everyone gets old. Everyone's body starts to break down on them and can't hear right, can't see right, become incontinent. You know, everyone is subject to old age. And again, this kind of blows Gautama's mind. So he immediately goes home again and turns on television. So like, I gotta like watch something. I gotta divert myself a little bit and entertain myself a little bit so that I don't have to think about this terrible thing, old age. But in the morning he gets curious again, so he hails the cab and again goes out. And this time he sees a funeral procession, And I don't know what they're like. I've never seen one in Singapore. But you know, in some places there's all these like black cars, hearses that carry a casket. In other places they carry the casket right on people's shoulders. and you see the corpse right there, and and so he says, like, what happened to that person? That person doesn't move anymore. I don't know if you've ever seen a dead body, but when you see your first dead body, it's rather striking. It's rather amazing, because you can't quite believe that they're, you want to try to wake them up or something. You can't quite believe that they're not just sleeping, or that if you tickle them, maybe they'll wake up again or something like that. And so maybe he even tries that. He pushes the corpse a little bit, and he's not moving again, doesn't wake up. What happened, Cabby? You see, well, that's a dead person. That person has died. And the Buddha said, oh, what a shame that happened to that one person. That one person, uniquely has suffered something called death. And the Cabby goes, dude, wake up here. Get out of your bubble. Death happens to everyone. You see, everyone is subject to death. And that really blows his mind. So again, he retreats back to his little bubble and, takes a hot bath and maybe a cold shower and a sauna, a spa bath. Probably takes a spa bath and, rubs some nice smelling oil on him afterwards. Oh, God. Tries to recover a little bit. And in the morning, he takes his final cab ride. And this time out in the real world, he sees somebody dressed in a special kind of a costume that indicates that they've made a kind of a life decision to try to live as a religious person, as a spiritual person. Maybe they're wearing red, or maybe they're wearing yellow, or, maybe they're wearing black with a little collar, or, something like that. But something, and he said, well, who's that? What kind of a person is that? And the cab driver says, that's a person who's trying to overcome the suffering that's associated with sickness and old age and death. That's a person who's pursuing a spiritual life. And the Buddhist, sorry, it's not the Buddha. And Gautama says, that sounds like a good idea to me. And he goes home and he kisses his wife and his child goodbye, actually. And he takes off on his spiritual quest. And so the first thing he takes off into the real world, into the spiritual quest, and he tries a lot of different things, He goes to a lot of different types of temples and retreats and yoga ashrams, and he goes to a Christian church maybe, and he then goes to the mosque, and because there's all kinds of options available, and so he explores the spiritual supermarket a little bit, and then he decides that what really is called for is to be really, really ascetic. You know what ascetic means? Like really renunciatory and really hard. So he maybe goes on a super meditation retreat where you just meditate all day long and do yoga and you eat only a little bit of vegetables like once in a while. And then he gets like, well, if I should do even more of that. So he starts fasting and, has like radical diet plans and, torments his body because his body seems like a big problem, all these desires that are coming from the body. And he torments himself, basically. And he becomes so weak from this tormenting, from this radical, approach to the spiritual life that he can't think straight anymore. That can happen, right? You fast too long. That's kind of why people do fast sometimes, is to get the high. You get like lightheaded, and and it kind of seems cool, and maybe this is spiritual. I think I'm in a spiritual state now. But you don't know what time it is, and you can't do arithmetic anymore. Because you're just so lightheaded, you can't think straight. So he realizes, well, this isn't the way either. This isn't the way to true happiness, this radical, approach. So he sets off on his own, and he sits down under a tree, and he says, I'm going to sit here until I figure this out. I'm going to sit here until I figure out how to be happy. And he goes into a kind of a meditation contemplation, and he thinks about it. You see, uses his brain, uses his head. What will really work? What will really bring me the happiness that I'm looking for? And he comes to some realizations about this. You know, the Buddhist text, they call this enlightenment, you know. Big realizations about the truth of things, about how things really are working and what will work to bring us a happier life. And he, so he figures it out, and he goes back to the, whatever it is, the ashram or whatever it is, where all of these, radical ascetics are like sitting there fasting and on some like strange diets and, cleanses, doing a lot of cleanses maybe, they've all lost a lot of weight, And they see him coming, and they see, well, he's pretty well fed because he's, restored his body so that it's strong again, and they start making fun of him, as he's coming down. He's like, oh, look at Fatso, he's not nearly as skin and bones as we are because we've done all these cleanses and fasts and everything, Look what a loser Gautama, here comes loser Gautama, who gave up on the hard road, he chickened out, And according to the story, the myth, Gautama at this point raises his hand and says, basically, shut up. That's a loose translation from the ancient Pali. Shut up. You don't know who you're talking to here. You see? Okay? Now sit down and listen. And then he gives the first teaching that he gives after his awakening, after his enlightenment. And in that first teaching, he teaches what we'll be learning tonight. The first things that come out of his mouth after his realization about reality and about what's going to work are these 4 things. 4, in Sanskrit they call them satya, in Pali satya, 4 truths. Satya in Sanskrit, it has also the connotation of meaning reality. 4 realities. Truth is the matching of, what you say with what is real, right? That's what truth means. So there are 4 matchings of words with reality. Okay? And like I said earlier, this was not, I'm going to teach Buddhism to you. Here's the 4 truths of Buddhism. He just said these are 4 truths. Universal truths. And it's my belief, I've studied religion for my whole lifetime. I don't know everything about every religion by any means. But it's my belief that every spiritual tradition has some version of each one of these 4 truths. Some version has got to be there in any tradition. So this isn't specifically Buddhist, you see. It's universal in its application, regardless of whether you think you're a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian or nothing, secular humanist, atheist, doesn't matter. They're still true. And they're true for everyone. So let's go through them, shall we? Enough intro. Now this is the worthy truth about distress. The word is dukkha. Many of you probably know this word, dukkha. Often translated as suffering. I try out different translations because sometimes they get old and we don't hear them anymore because we've heard it so many times. This is the truth of suffering. But what about distress or stress? Some of us, especially those of us living in the bubble, not venturing out into the world that much, the real world. We don't relate to the idea of suffering. Like, oh, what do you mean suffering? You hear all these Buddhists talking about, life is suffering. Buddhists say everything's suffering. You Buddhists, you should cheer up, What do you mean? You should get out more. Go to the mall, it's not suffering. Go to Orchard Road, not suffering. The 3D movie that I saw last night in air-conditioned comfort while eating popcorn, that wasn't suffering. I'm not suffering. What are you talking about? But so to change it up a little bit and say stressful or distressed, just as a, to hear it may be different. Here's the worthy truth about distress, O monks. He's speaking to the, to a monastic order. Birth is stressful. Old age is stressful. Sickness is stressful. And death is stressful. Sound better than suffering? Yeah, And I'll go through this again. We'll unpack it. When confronted with what is disagreeable, it's stressful. When it's stressful to be separated from what is agreeable, what you like, right? When you're confronted with what you don't like, it's stressful. And when you're separated from something that you do like, that's you get stressed out. You can say, you get stressed out. And when we don't get what we want, it's stressful. In short, grasping to the 5 groups of mental and physical things that make up a person is stressful. So let's go through these one by one. Birth is stressful, old age is stressful, sickness is stressful, and death is stressful. Is that true? Is birth stressful? You think birth is stressful for the baby? Let's start with the baby, okay? You've been sitting in there in kind of like warm fluid for 9 months. And then what gradually happens is that, you get bigger and the space gets more and more claustrophobic in there, right? In the embryo, as the embryo. Yeah? And then something happens that you're not in control of, and all of a sudden you start pushed down through a tiny little birth canal. Usually head first, and brought into this like cold light, right? What's the first thing that the baby does to make sure that they're alive? What's the first thing we do to know that they're alive? Well, how do we? They cry. Of course you would cry. Everyone cries, right? It's stressful. There's a theory, there's a theory that the reason that we don't remember our past lives, which we don't, I think, anybody who's really honest, sometimes people make stuff up. But, for most of us who are honest about it, we don't remember anything about our past lives, If you don't believe me, like, quick, what was your gender? What language did you speak? Who were you married to? What were your name of your kids?